Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and we're going to have a nice conversation today about DEI and the methods by which it's spread. And to help us with that is a writer and filmmaker who's also the co-founder and editor of The Black Sheep and the lead writer and co-producer of the YouTube channel Beyond Now, Joseph Jake Klein. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you. Great to be here, Michael.
So, what is DEI and what is its connection to critical theory of the Frankfurt School?
Sure. So DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. It doesn't really mean diversity, equity, and inclusion in the ways that we traditionally think of it. It means diversity of identity characteristics. So that might be diversity of skin color, or diversity of disability, or gender identity, or something like that. Doesn't really mean equity in the way that we traditionally think of it. Equity, I think most people think of as fairness. I guess they do sort of mean it that way, but fairness to them seems to be this sort of Marxist conception of equality of outcomes. So that's very different than equality of opportunity or equal treatment under the law. And then inclusion of basically the categories that I said before, the diverse categories. Everybody is supposed to feel that they have a part in their process. But really what it seems to mean is inclusion of anybody who already agrees fully with the ideas of this ideology, right? And the exclusion of anybody else. So, I think diversity, equity, and inclusion are very important values. But for me, diversity means diversity of thought, diversity of ideas, people bringing something new and valuable to the conversation. Equity does mean fairness, and it's a traditional conception, which I think, I understand that you're a Randian, so I think we're probably pretty aligned on this, which is, equal treatment under the law, individual rights, meritocracy, all that sort of stuff. That's what I consider to be equity properly defined. And then inclusion. I mean, inclusion should include anybody who can make the process better, who can help inform us better and make better decisions. So that's what I support. And unfortunately, that's not often what's being practiced under the name DEI. So I think you had two questions there. So that's probably the answer to your first one. Remind me the second half.
What is its connection to the Frankfurt School and critical theory?
Okay. So my book here, Redefining Racism, I track a slightly different origin than the one that many others have written about in critical theory. So there is a connection to critical theory in that you have a lot of, basically what critical theory is it's these theories that seek to critique systems of power. Particularly, critical theory starts as a neo-Marxist movement, and you get what's called, this is a controversial term, but I'll stand by it, cultural Marxism out of critical theory, which means, instead of doing the oppressor versus oppressed dynamics that we see in classical Marxism, which is based on bourgeoisie and proletariat, economic classes, instead it's based on all these other different groups that we're going to apply that same dynamic thinking to, right? And especially when you have critical theory take a postmodern turn, not all critical theorists are postmodernists, but some are. And what they then do is they make it even much worse. And they talk about, there's really no underlying reality. There's just groups vying for power and competing against each other in this endless power game. And so when the way that connects into DEI is that when you see that routed through these immutable identity characteristics through racial groups, postmodernists believe that everything is a social construction. I certainly don't believe that, but I do believe race is a social construction. I don't think that race accurately maps onto any of the things that people try to measure using that term. It doesn't even apply to skin color very well. You'll have people that if they have one black ancestor, they're considered, black under this racial social construction system. It's not a good way to talk about what I think is really much more interesting, which is, genetic population groups and cultural groups and much, much more accurate labels to try to get at what race is trying to describe. But anyway, so when you see this power, these power games, oppressed versus oppressor dynamic, applied to race, applied to these identity groups that DEI deals with, that's what happens in a lot of places where DEI is being taught. And it's very, very toxic because it teaches us not to see our world as a place where we can all contribute to everybody's success. A rising tide can lift all boats, but instead it's this fixed pie society where we all have to compete for the power in society. And anyone who has power, regardless of how they got it, they don't really care. They don't want to look at that because they think all the structures of our society are socially constructed. Anybody that has power, even if I think what you and I would consider earned legitimately power, that is inherently oppressive until we have this purely equalitarian society. So all this stuff, it's kind of a backdoor for classical Marxism, argued through different means, but ultimately working to the same goal in terms of, everybody should have the same outcomes, a perfectly equal society, regardless of inputs.
You mentioned cultural Marxism. It's a term that I have to confess I really don't like. And the reason that I don't like it, so I think I understand what you in particular mean by the term. It's like in criminology, for instance, they have conflict criminology, and it's about oppressor and oppressed. And in critical theory, you could take the Marxist lens of bourgeoisie and proletariat and just apply it to different groups. And I think when you say cultural Marxism, that's what you're doing. You're saying that there's this claim that certain cultures are oppressing others and we need to equalize them, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, kind of thing. The reason I don't like the term is because Marxism becomes too easy of a pejorative accusation toward people with whom one disagrees. And I mean, we hear it all the time. Kamala Harris is a Marxist. Whatever politician, whatever writer they don't like is a Marxist. And what ends up happening is the term becomes watered down to the point where it's meaningless. Marxism as a political economic philosophy entails historicism and the idea that there's this evolution of society moving in a certain direction, and this conflict that we have now, well, at the time he wrote, was bourgeoisie and proletariat, and is ultimately going to end with the overthrowing of the capitalist class and the institution of the dictatorship of the proletariat. I mean, it's a whole sophisticated idea. And when terms are used by the general public, for lack of a better word that I can come up with off the top of my head, or partisans would probably be even better. I just think it minimizes it. Is that something that concerns you when you use a term like cultural Marxism? Because I ultimately, in reading your viewpoint, I think your critique is spot on. And I think that terminology can, not that it does, but it can take away from it. So what are your thoughts on that?
I'm not particularly worried about that personally, but I don't have, I think, as strong feelings as you about it. I'm willing to admit you may be right. I may be wrong. I'm not sure. But here's the reasons that I don't really worry about that. So first of all, where I agree with you very much is that I think the label Marxism is overused and overbroadly applied when it does refer to a specific philosophy. I think that we could say, and I would say, that Kamala Harris has said Marxist things before, but that doesn't mean that she's an adherent of Marxism, right? And
Yeah.
so when I say she says Marxist things, it's like, okay, well, she said this sentence or this paragraph or had this policy proposal that would align with with what the Marxists want, but would not entail alignment with the entire philosophy. There was also a social media ad she put out a couple of years ago that I think really aligned with the cultural Marxist label in the way that I've used it here. I can't remember the details to quote it back to you, but perhaps viewers will remember. I remember it was this climbing up a mountain animation, and she's talking about how we all ultimately need to get to the same place, and we need to get to this equality of outcome, regardless of the identity things that stand in our way, and that concerns me. So I do think that there are reasons at times to level those accusations against people like Kamala Harris, against people who are not full Marxists in their philosophy. But I do think it's important to use language carefully. And so I don't think most people do that. And I would advocate that they be better at that. We should say that's a Marxist idea. That was a Marxist statement. That was a culturally Marxist statement. That was, and not give the misrepresentation that this is the entire ideology and that's all Marxism is. Now, with cultural Marxism, as I've used it, your critique is a good one. I don't think it's the typical one, although I have heard it before. The typical one that I see is it's considered to be like an anti-Jewish conspiracy theory, because a lot of the Frankfurt School was Jewish, and there are legitimate anti-Semites who use it that way. But ultimately saying that this small subset of people that when they use the term cultural Marxism, mean this anti-Jewish conspiracy theory, saying that all mention of cultural Marxism is an anti-Jewish conspiracy theory, that seems like an attempt to shut down debate, to misrepresent what people are saying. So that bothers me a lot. Your critique, I think, is a lot more pointed, a lot more worthwhile. However, the reason I would say it doesn't bother me that much is because I'm using a qualifier. By the fact that I'm saying cultural Marxism, I'm not saying Marxism. So I am saying it's something different. There's already something that's turning it into something else. Now, where I say you might be right and I might be wrong is I don't know how that's going to land with every person. So if that does lead people to run with that term, thinking that they have an understanding of classical Marxism or that these are somehow the same thing, and that I'm not just using the term to refer to the Marxism and cultural Marxism as the term to refer to one really defining feature of what Marxism is, not the only one, but a major one, which is that sort of power battle, oppressed versus oppressor dynamic. I would not want them to come away with that misunderstanding. My estimation is that they're probably not coming away with that misunderstanding, again, because I am using the qualifier to turn it into a different term. But I could be wrong. You could be right. If I start to think that you're right, I will stop using that term.
So who was this guy, Kurt Lewin?
Okay, so Kurt Lewin was a social psychologist. He was affiliated with the Frankfurt School, but he's not really considered a member of the Frankfurt School. And he gets really interested in these ideas of group dynamics. How do people, when they exist in groups, start to influence each other and change each other's thinking and just general influenceability? Okay, so he does some things that I assume this information is still classified, so I don't know a lot of the details of it, but he was the director of the Psychological Warfare Center for the Far East, the OS and the OSS being the US predecessor organization to the CIA. So he did that during World War II, very good cause. Obviously he's fighting, I guess if it's the Far East, the Japanese. So, I think that's a worthwhile time to be using psychological warfare. And he himself, he escaped from the Nazis. He was affiliated with the Frankfurt School when it was actually in Frankfurt. So, good reason to care about these issues. But that's kind of where his subject matter interest went. And I don't have a huge bone to pick with Kurt Lewin in particular, actually. Um, he Again, he's studying these change processes. So he talks about some stuff that could be seen as early descriptions of brainwashing techniques. He talks about like unfreezing somebody's currently held views, making changes, and then refreezing them, right? And that refreezing is where a little bit of the problem comes in, because why do you necessarily want to refreeze somebody's views into whatever you're trying to tell them? You know, somebody should be having a constantly re-evolving system of thought that's subject to new information and new thinking and development. So, but you know, he's also kind of just describing how the process works a little. But he goes on to found this organization called the NTL Institute, or the National Training Laboratories. And he dies before the organization starts functioning. But what his successors do at this organization is they start developing this group dynamics technique called the T group, where people meet in these unstructured groups and they talk about themselves and they try to kind of find more like self-awareness and like change themselves. It's part of what was called the human potential movement. This idea that psychology could be used to, you know, not just fix maladies. It's similar and is affiliated with a lot of the thinkers that are under the label of positive psychology. So the idea that psychology can be used to actually improve us and help us reach our full potential. And I don't have any issues with that. I support positive psychology in a lot of ways. But this T group technique gets used in a lot of very culty ways. And what you start to find happening is people reaching consensus in these groups just by the nature of the group dynamics techniques and how the leaders act in them. And this starts to get very, very culty. It gets adopted and modified by literal cults. There's a cult called Synanon, which was very prominent. It marketed itself as sort of Alcoholics Anonymous-like organization, but for people suffering from all sorts of drug issues. And ultimately, they all start shaving their heads. They live on a compound. They get involved in murders. And ultimately, the IRS shuts them down because they don't pay taxes. But, you know, that roots out of these techniques that were developed by, at its core, starting with Kurt Lewin. And he was Marxist aligned. At one of something he said shortly before his death was Marx was right. So he's on record saying that. And then another cult that comes out of these techniques, and these techniques specifically at the NTL Institute, is the cult of New White Consciousness, which is the anti-racist philosophy that will ultimately get talked about by figures like Robin DiAngelo. These white anti-racists that teach workshops and all this sort of stuff.
You just brought me to my next question.
Okay.
I was going to actually ask you, who is Robin DiAngelo?
Okay, so Robin DiAngelo, I can't quite remember what her degree is in, but she's
Self-hatred?
academic.
I don't know.
Well, so that's actually an interesting discussion, if I can sidebar to talk about
Sure.
that for a second. So there's this idea that because what these people believed, part of this new white consciousness philosophy, Robin DiAngelo doesn't use that name. That's a name from the early 1970s, but it's the exact same philosophy that Robin DiAngelo teaches, exact same philosophy. There's what it teaches is that the best a white person can be is an anti-racist racist, because all white people are racist by definition, because you have privileges in a allegedly white supremacist society. So, you know, that would obviously, to most people, I think, entail a feeling of guilt. I'm a racist. I'm benefiting from privilege, which is inherently oppressing other people. They did not see it this way. Okay. So coming out of this human potential movement, out of this trying to reach self-enlightenment through positive psychology techniques, they saw it as, aha, I have realized my true nature. And now by realizing it, I have no reason to feel bad and can work against it, which creates more cult-like behaviors. It's a cult. It's this philosophy of new white consciousness, this philosophy of white awareness and white fragility provides all the answers to the original sin of your whiteness in our society. So they don't see it as guilt, as self-flagellation, but nonetheless, this is the effect that it had on most of the people trained in this stuff. The trainers may have reached some amount of enlightenment, but they kept records that I go through in this book of course evaluations for their workshops and what were the feelings people had going in beforehand and what were the feelings people had afterwards. And it's things like anxiety, depression, hopelessness, guilt. So that is the effect that this philosophy has. So in terms of who Robin DiAngelo is, she is a consultant to major corporations, including Netflix and Amazon, on anti-racism and DEI. And I put anti-racism in quotes because I really do not acknowledge that this is anti-racist at all. I think it's an extraordinarily racist philosophy. And they use a different definition of racism to get themselves to that name. The full title of this book is Redefining Racism, How Racism Became Power Plus Prejudice. And that definition does a lot of heavy lifting. So when they say anti-racist, they don't mean anti-discrimination and prejudice based on race like most people mean it. And they use that redefinition to kind of manipulate people into thinking that's what they mean until they ultimately unveil, this whole different framework. So she spreads this philosophy, and she does it with this academic credibility that she got from, having her PhD. And she wrote an enormously successful book that people bought based on that PhD and based on the fact that people take her seriously. White Fragility. She has another book called Nice Racism, but White Fragility spent, I think, I say the exact number in the book, but like over 150 weeks on the New York Times bestsellers list. So it did massive numbers. She appeared on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. That's how big she is. So she is the lead purveyor of these ideas over the last decade. But she launders it through that academic credibility. And that's not where these ideas come from. I mean, obviously, there's so much garbage in academia anyway that really shouldn't matter to anyone. But I track where these ideas actually came from that she taught. And you know who they come from? High school teachers. High school teachers invented all this stuff in the Detroit area after they got funding, because there were major race riots in 1967, and Governor George Romney and other community leaders and business leaders in the area were like, well, we don't want riots to happen again, and we need to rebuild Detroit. They put some money into good things, and then some money goes into radical organizations that they're widely accused of paying off as riot insurance, because they wanted to give it to the radical organizations so they wouldn't riot and burn down the city again. And so they get this funding and teach these really radical Black nationalist, again, in my terminology, culturally Marxist ideas in high schools, to high school students, to teachers, and in corporate workshops. So, this is not the philosophy that Robin DiAngelo teaches. It's not the philosophy of like deeply considered academic work, looking at all the literature. No, it's the work of high school teachers, that white high school teachers, I want to point out, following in Black nationalist thought, explicitly anti-integrationist thought, explicitly Marxist thought, that then they're laundering into a different teaching system. And then Robin DiAngelo is laundering it yet again by making it seem like these are more credible and more developed ideas that came out of academia when they didn't. They were post hoc justified with academic arguments.
So how do these things tie together? In other words, how does Robin DiAngelo and others use the methods of Kurt Lewin and the NTL to facilitate the spread of DEI?
Okay, so okay, I want to make a couple clarifications there. So
Okay.
first of all, DEI can be a couple different things.
Okay.
There's more moderate DEI, which it still will ask you to judge people by the color of their skin and their immutable characteristics. So, I oppose it. But it's not teaching like the full scale, this white on white anti-racism of Robin DiAngelo and her predecessors. So that's a subset of DEI. And when I just want to clarify, when I'm talking about DEI, that's what I'm going to be talking about.
Okay.
Okay, so how does it use the ideas of Lewin and NTL? So what it uses is these groups, you put people together in a workshop in some sort of anti-racism or DEI workshop or whatever label it ends up going out under. They used to call it in the 1970s racism awareness training. That was the label they used over and over again. So it has people sort of talk to each other and asks leading questions so that they investigate like their whiteness and the nature of their whiteness. So
Well,
this
hold on,
definition,
hold on. How does
yeah,
one investigate their whiteness? I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt, but that's like just
yeah.
sounds ridiculous. Like, what do I do? I look in the mirror and I don't, like, what do they do?
Okay, so I don't really know the answer to that question totally
Okay.
because I have not done it. I mean, I've done it and come to immediate conclusions of this is just my skin color and I shouldn't take it to mean anything else. But the people that decide to take it in a different direction, I mean, one good example would be this anti-racist writer named Peggy McIntosh wrote an essay. Again, I don't know the exact title off the top of my head, but it's like unpacking the knapsack of like white privilege, something along those lines. Those words are not exactly right. And so what she does in this essay is she goes through a list of things that she considers to be example of her white privilege in our racist society. So that will be things like, when I watch TV and movies and read the news, I see people that are of my race. When the IRS audits me, I won't be worried that it's because of my race. I've not heard much about the IRS auditing people based on skin color, if they even have access to that information. But that's one of the things she says is a white privilege that happens. So um, it'll be things like, when I go to the grocery store, I'm not worried about being followed, or treated with suspicion. Um, some of these things, there is prejudice in society. There is racism, and she wrote that essay in 1989. We've gotten progressively better over time with a backtrack in the last couple of years. Um, but there's racist prejudice that happens. But then these certain things like, I don't see people of my skin color. I can live in a community that is all my skin color. Why is that a privilege? Why is that a good thing? Why I don't understand. Well, I do understand because I've researched into it, which is it comes from this anti-integrationist school of thought that's actually racial justice and harmony is what that looks like in their anti-racist philosophy. Um, but in my view, that is extraordinarily racist that you would care the skin color of the people that you live around. Um, I don't care. And I think it's racist to care. So that's the sort of thing that investigating your whiteness might look like.
So how, so what do they do in these classes? I mean, you
Right.
say they
Okay.
investigate whiteness, like you mentioned
So
earlier, this defreezing and refreezing.
yeah.
How are they actually doing that to spread the
Yeah. Okay.
DEI?
So let me give you an example again, based on the specific thing that this book, what I do is I track this redefinition of the word racism. And in doing so, it ends up tracking these racism awareness trainings, the DEI trainings with a older name that that redefinition like happened in. It was done by, again, high school teachers that were running those sessions. So how do they get that definition to stick in people's heads? That racism is power plus prejudice rather than prejudice or discrimination based on race. Here's how they did it. They asked their participants, okay, what is the difference between prejudice and racism? Because, these are two different concepts and therefore they must have different meanings. Okay, so already, they've asked a leading question there. And the participants, they just go with it. There must be a substantial difference. The trainer is telling us that there's a difference, and the trainer is telling us that, prejudice based on race, that's not enough. These have to be different concepts. And so they just go along with that. And then they come to the conclusion themselves, right? With a couple other leading questions, with some very tilted definitions from non-traditional sources that they're given in a list. They talk amongst themselves and they're led to that conclusion. But they feel that that power plus prejudice is the correct definition. But they feel as if they've come up with it entirely themselves. And that was a very important part of Lewin and NTL's understanding of change, is you have to come to it yourself. You can't just coerce, by forcing it upon somebody. But what you can do is manipulate people and psychologically prime highly agreeable people to accept it. And that that forms the bulk of how this technique works.
How well is it working? I mean, like I've heard that DEI is petering out, that it's basically, it peaked and now a lot of people have just had it. But if these techniques are really successful, it would seem that it would be growing. So what is the future in your view of DEI?
So it is in decline right now. Um, I have an op-ed that should be coming out soon in Presser magazine, making that same point, and that this is great news that it's in decline. However, they're playing the long game, and it being in decline now doesn't mean that it will be in decline forever. Um, Robin DiAngelo is a much more toxic figure than she was just 2 years ago. She was made a bit of a laughing stock in Matt Walsh's new movie, Am I Racist? Very funny movie. I highly recommend people go see it. It's still in theaters. Um, she got she got tricked into giving interpersonal reparations to Matt Walsh's black producer, and everybody thinks that that's every reasonable person thinks that's silly and ridiculous, but that is the end result of her philosophy, and that was made clear. She was publicly accused of plagiarism, that her work really closely matches with minority scholars. So she stole from the people she's, claiming to like uplift and defend with her philosophy. Um, I think that plagiarism has been challenged a bit. She wasn't actually sanctioned for it, but it was a bad look. And I reveal here she plagiarized much, much, much more than what was in those recent accusations. They're from white activists in the early 1970s, not from minorities, but nonetheless, she's a horrible plagiarist, even if she wasn't sanctioned in these most recent accusations. So that's a bad look. I think there's kind of a general societal sense that things went a little bit too far after the killing of George Floyd, and in the response of appropriate sympathy towards that situation. Another example would be the Black Lives Matter global network, which many, many major corporations, Microsoft and others, donated money to during the Black Lives Matter protests and riots. They were widely revealed to have like blown money on super high salaries and paying for a house and all sorts of horrible things. So there's and now they're a toxic brand. So you're correct. There has been a decline, but there was a decline in the early 90s too. So there was a little wave of political correctness in that period, and it kind of made some cultural gains, but then flamed out. And then they built up, and then, with the Black Lives Matter movement and with the killing of George Floyd, they had a major opportunity to push these ideas again. And they did. And they made a lot of cultural gains and captured a lot of institutions. DEI is in decline, but we didn't have it at all before. So the net gains are still substantial that they made in our culture. And now it's flaming out a bit, but they're there. There are people that really believe this. They believe it deeply. And when they have a opportunity to push it again, they will. So I think we need to be vigilant. We need to make sure that the antidote to these toxic ideas is widely known so that we're just as ready as they are. One of the things I discussed in the book is they had a conscious strategy called an insider-outsider strategy. This was the strategy of the ones that did workshops with corporations specifically. So the outside strategy was, we're going to be doing all these protests. There might be riots. There's going to be a lot of pressure on the corporations to make major changes. And then on the inside, we're going to train, executives in these ideas so that they're sympathetic, and we have our people inside. And then the people inside are going to react to the outside pressure, and that's how we're going to get it through. And boy, did they succeed in that strategy. So I think we need to be aware of that and be counter messaging it for when they go for their next assault.
So I had a question, maybe a couple questions. In my view, DEI, woke, critical race theory, Black Lives Matter, I mean, this is all garbage. It's really toxic and really harmful. But I think that culturally, the people that oppose these, or rather some of the people that oppose these, do more harm by the manner in which they oppose it. For instance, if somebody said to me, will you say Black Lives Matter? Sure, Black Lives Matter, and the organization's garbage. It's not hard, but I've seen people, they're asked, can you say Black Lives Matter? All lives matter. And it just comes off like, why can't you just say it? I mean, it's true, and you don't have to support the organization. And the biggest thing that I've seen is with the death of George Floyd, the efforts that people have gone to clear the names in the public eye of the police officers is absurd. I can't tell you how many posts I've seen on social media. George Floyd died of a drug overdose. And it's very easy to find out that's not the case. They're misinterpreting the toxicology report. They're misinterpreting the autopsy, but they keep repeating it. And then it becomes, well, why are you so invested in proving that this guy died of a drug overdose? And then the motivation comes into play. And I'm just curious what do you think about how those narratives and the people who push them affect the kind of work that you're trying to do, which, by the way, from everything I've seen, and I've by no means read everything you've written, but from what I've seen, you're doing good work. It's intellectually
Thank you.
driven. It serves a good purpose, but then you have those folks, and I wonder what's the, I don't know if overlap's the right word, but how do they affect what you're trying to do?
Okay, so let's, because I don't want to attack. There's a lot of people who I'm a huge fans of who have made those kinds of mistakes. So I just want to be careful to differentiate the act of like saying something that I think is using unproductive language from the people doing that who, that unproductive language might only be 10% of the things they say at the topic. And then the other 90% is extraordinarily productive. So, nobody's perfect. But I agree with you that the language is unhelpful. I advocate at the end of the book in my conclusions that we cannot give up the term anti-racist. We're anti-racist. I'm an anti-racist. Okay. The reason they have gotten as far as they have is because almost everyone in our society knows that racism was a horrible evil. People were enslaved, people were segregated, people were lynched, and much more. Okay. That's not even touching the surface. So that does a lot of heavy lifting. And when they're able to call themselves anti-racists, and when people on our side that agree with us on the issues, but they're not using the right language to describe even their own views, when they say, oh, I oppose anti-racism, that backfires because, the normies see that and they're like, it fulfills their own confirmation bias of like, look, racism is actually this huge problem in our society. There's all these people that are against anti-racism. The natural logical conclusion for that is because they're racist. And the media doesn't help with this because they're left biased and they're the ones presenting all these people that are saying, we're against anti-racism and we're against diversity and we're against equity and we're against inclusion. And they paint it in a way that's primed to lead to exactly that conclusion for their viewers. And yeah, there is a subset of people that they're, they're against anti-racists because they're white nationalists. I mean, that exists. I don't want to deny that. They're a problem. I'm against those people and it needs to be talked about. They're growing. I don't think they've grown nearly as much as what's happened on the left. Again, Robin DiAngelo was on Jimmy Fallon. She was on the New York Times
Sure.
bestseller list for 150 weeks. So I don't think it's even close to approximating
Yeah.
the
Well, she's
cultural
given
influence.
legitimacy, right?
Right.
Those folks are given legitimacy, whereas the white nationalists, Christian nationalists, that's understood that they're illegitimate. And
Yeah.
so it's asymmetrical, I guess, in that when you use terms like anti-racist or diversity, equity, inclusion, is you're playing on the sort of, I don't want to say intrinsic, but you're playing on the general acceptance that these are good things. So
Yes.
like when I've been asked, do you think Black Lives Matter? I said, well, the slogan, sure. But there's the slogan and then there's the organization, and they're not the same thing. The organization takes the slogan because they know you can't disagree with that and come off right. So when you're saying you don't see the term anti-racist, I agree. So if somebody says, are you an anti-racist? The thing to do is yes, but it's being misused by the very people who are pushing it.
Correct. So what I advocate people do is don't run away from the terms DEI, recapture the terms DEI, and push true diversity, equity, and inclusion under their proper definitions. And listen, this is all strategy. I could be wrong about strategy. I
Sure.
know Chris Rufo, who's a prominent activist in this space, very much disagrees with me on that. He wants to push merit, equality, and I can't remember the third one. And listen, I mean, if he can do that, if he can defeat DEI that way, I'm all for it because ultimately it's about the right ideas getting in place. But I think for a lot of people in our society, you're just not going to get them to give the time and generosity to learn the full details of our perspective, to come around on why DEI is bad. So that means we have to do actual, like true DEI and marginalize this fake DEI, but that's mainstream, that is going out under that label. Same with anti-racism. They're not anti-racists. They're racist. They're anti-integrationists. Um, they're bad. We're the true anti-racists. Um, we're against the Black Lives Matter global network. We believe Black Lives Matter. We also, think that a lot of the protests going on by the decentralized Black Lives Matter movement, was perhaps caused by some faulty information and by untrue mimetic ideas about police brutality. You can look at Roland Fryer's research, finding that no, Black men are not disproportionately killed by police more. So, although there are more traffic stops and other things, and insofar as racism is to cause for that, we should put a stop to that. But there's also multivariate analysis. Like, have you looked at, is there more crime in this neighborhood, and that's why they're doing more traffic stops, and whatever else is going on. So it might not be race; it might just be things that correlate with race. And so that needs to be uh, looked at more seriously than it is, because it suits the agenda of a lot of people to paint, race as being responsible for all this, and that there's all these racists in our society that need to be dealt with, and therefore fund my anti-racism programs and my nonprofit and our DEI efforts and all that sort of stuff. And that's backwards. So we need to stop that by recapturing the terms and appealing to the decision makers who are sympathetic to those terms, rather than trying to get them to change their entire worldview. That is something we should focus on. I think I haven't looked into too much of your work, so I apologize, but I looked into a little. I think you're an objectivist, yes?
Yes.
Okay. Well, Ayn Rand is a wonderful person at changing people's entire worldviews. And, if we can get all these people to read Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead, I will be very happy. But I think
All right.
I think we should start a little bit more manageable and take the gains that we can get. And you're not going to be able to get that from most people, unfortunately.
All right. Is there anything that we left out that you think we should have covered as relates to this topic?
Oh boy, there's so much to talk about. I don't really know where to go without questions, because there's just so many possible directions. But
Okay.
we can put a stop to this. We will put a stop to this. But it requires people understanding what we can get them to understand of the ideas, using the right language, not falling into the traps that these anti-racism educators are very, very effective and successful at putting in front of people in these workshops and in their writing and in the discourse. So learn about them, be aware of them, educate on them, and we'll be ready for the next assault when they try to take more of our cultural ground. And if they do, I mean, this is really serious. Again, we were disagreeing a little bit about cultural Marxism and whether that's a good term or not, but the end result of this philosophy, whatever you want to call it, if it takes hold, will be just as bad as what took place in the Soviet Union, because as the great Ludwig von Mises showed, you cannot do economic calculation when you have a command economy, and ultimately that's what they're pushing. Is we're going to have a command economy that is going to create equality by giving or equity, equality of outcome, by giving everybody exactly equal amounts of everything. And there's a lot of horrible things that happened in the Soviet Union, but that was the ultimate like killing flaw that made quality of life horrible And then to try to keep that horrible system running, they had to kill people and commit genocides and have this horrible authoritarian system. So Ibram X. Kendi, one of the leading anti-racists today. I talk about him a little bit in this book, but I mostly track this Robin DiAngelo, like white on white school of thought. He proposed a constitutional amendment with a Department of Anti-Racism that would be in charge of equalizing outcomes. Okay. If something like that were to get passed, that's the end of meritocracy. That's the end of a functioning economy. That's the end of life in America. It would not look particularly different from what Rand wrote about in headphone fell out, sorry. What Rand wrote about in We the Living. So, you know, that book is a nightmare. This, we know through many other sources what life under communism was like, was a nightmare. And let's not let it happen here. And I know it sounds silly that it could happen here to many people. That sounds hyperbolic, but I assure you, this is what they thought in most of the countries where it ended up happening. We published at the Black Sheep an essay by a Romanian who lived under Ceausescu and moved to the United States. And, you know, they thought the same thing in Romania, you know, before that fell to communism. I don't know, I use this slogan a lot. I don't know who to credit it to, and I should really look it up so that I can give proper attribution. But change happens slowly, and then it happens all at once. And if you watch for that, if you look for major societal change, you'll start to notice that that's how it happens. So be worried about this. Don't drive yourself crazy. Don't, you know, damage your mental health. Like, you know, just worried about the fall of our civilization. I've seen some people do that, but be vigilant and don't think, oh, you know, this is just some small thing going on in corporations. This is just some silly teachers. Like, oh, they don't really matter. It matters. They've had more cultural influence than they should have, and they're way closer to the levers of power than they should be. And this will not be some minor decrease in quality of life if they take power. It will be utter devastation to our country and our system.
So where can people find you?
I'm on Twitter at Joseph J. Klein. I am my Substack is The Black Sheep, wetheblacksheep.com. If you subscribe to The Black Sheep, we're running a promotion right now where you get the ebook of this free included, but this is also available on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. If you buy it through my shop, I'll sign it. So you can find the shop at wetheblacksheep.com. And yeah, so major things are I'm on Twitter at Joseph J. Klein, and I'm at wetheblacksheep.com.
Well, thank you very much for taking time out of your day to be with us.
Thank you so much, Michael. I really enjoyed it. Happy to do it anytime.
Thank you. For now,
Thanks.
this is the Rational Egoist signing out. Till next time.